Kate Winkler Dawson.
And I'm Paul Holes.
This is Buried Bones.
Hi, Kate. How are you today?
I'm well, Paul. I told you the worst story last week, the Villisca axe murders. Have you been thinking about the offender, whoever did all of this horrible stuff?
No, it is a horrific crime. And of course, it's one of those things as I was sitting down and saying, okay, we're going to be hearing more about this case. I'm going through the details in my head going, who would do this, and is it somebody I know? Early on, I was thinking it was somebody close to the Moore family. Now, I'm unsure about that.
Well, we've got some interesting suspects, but let me go through the case really quickly. So it's 1912, Villisca, Iowa, a prosperous but small town, 2,500 people. We're looking at the Moore family. You've got 4 kids, all of 11 and under, 3 boys and a girl. We have Sarah and Josiah Moore, no enemies that we could tell. Everybody's been murdered, including the 2 little girls who were sleeping in their guest room on the first floor of their farmhouse. The 12-year-old appears to have been posed and sexually assaulted, but we don't know 100% sure yet. There's some really weird things in the house. Slab of bacon laying on the floor in a sack in the bedroom, and then some more raw bacon, it sounds like, on the floor in the kitchen. Looks like somebody's eaten there. Somebody's washed off there. There's an axe that's been taken that was owned by Josiah. And that we have a series that you were really interested in of murders that seem similar, more than just people taking an axe throughout the Midwest and killing people. There's some real interesting correlations between what happened, especially with Lena, who was the 12-year-old girl who seemed to be sort of the person that was homed in on, versus, everybody else. And so we've been talking about that. The Colorado Springs sheriff says, I think this is a series, but it doesn't seem like other people will agree with him. And so it sounds like they're being investigated separately, which probably could be a mistake. We don't know yet. Is that a pretty good summary?
No, that sounds perfect as normal, Kate.
See, that's what I like to hear. Okay, let's run into some suspects. So the first one is, I mentioned that we were going to be talking about a reverend. Here's our reverend. His name is Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, but we're going to call him Lynn.
Okay.
So this is a guy who catches their attention. He is petite. He's 5 foot. I don't know if I've ever called a man petite before, but he's slight. You want to go with slight? I don't know.
Petite, slight. It works for me.
Okay, good. Speaking as a man who you have self-identified as a slight man, you're not a particularly tall guy, right?
No. I am the average American male. I'm 5'10", or at least I like to say I'm 5'10".
Oh, all right. So you're way taller than this guy. This guy's 5'2". He's 119 pounds, and a traveling preacher from England. So here's what they think is interesting about Lynn, Reverend Lynn, I'll call him that, Reverend Lynn. The night of the murder, Reverend Lynn was being hosted at the Presbyterian Church, which is where the Moores went and were all day until they were murdered that night. So Reverend Lynn left Villisca for Macedonia, Iowa, which is about 40 miles away, on the 5:19 a.m. westbound train the very next day. So 2 hours before the neighbor discovers the Moores, he is on a westbound train. But since then, he has been in frequent contact with the Villisca detectives and the county and state attorneys and Josiah's brother Ross, who was the one who showed up and first discovered all the bodies. In lengthy and meandering statements, you got all of those, Reverend Lynn wrote that he had spied a man's shadow, which was illuminated by a street light, as the man crept into the Moore house while they were at church. An accomplice, put in air quotes, waited nearby, and he later heard the thuds of an axe. And on the train the next morning, he noticed there was a suspicious stranger. And there are just flat out weird things about Reverend Lynn, but give me your impressions so far.
Well, I guess I'm confused as Where is Reverend Lynn? How is he spotting somebody creeping into the Moore house and hearing, thuds? Where is he at this point?
So my understanding is because the church is so close, he might have been outside. You can see the house, I believe, from the church. And so his argument is that he's kind of been in the area and he could see from 3 blocks down somebody creeping in. Now the thuds, that's another thing that is odd. But, and then of course the generic suspicious stranger. It's a weird story. And I think that's what gets the attention of investigators in Villisca.
Yeah, no, it's got my attention because it's almost as if he is inserting himself into the investigation.
Yeah.
Because even though the church is near the Moore's house, he is observing the Moore's house at a point where he's seeing the offender supposedly going in, and then is hearing thuds. And are these thuds, the axe striking the victim's heads? Are these thuds the axe striking, the ceiling? And this might be in some ways how, when people are trying to give statements where they're trying to prove their innocence, but they end up pulling in details of the crime because they think that law enforcement, the interrogator, is going to suspect them up front. And so they have to kind of say, well, I saw this or I heard this, just to at least give them some distance from being the actual person committing the crime. So right away, I'm suspicious of Reverend Lynn myself.
Well, and what's interesting is based on the description of the contamination that happened at the crime scene, I was thinking there is no way that anybody who walked into that house or even was on the outside of the house probably did not know every single detail that happened in that case. I just wonder if there's anything to withhold when people have walked through the house so they know it's Josiah's axe. Otherwise, he would have said, I saw the guy carrying an axe,
Yeah, but even though you have all of these, let's say, I'll just call them civilian witnesses that are making observations, I would say probably all of them don't know what they're looking at.
Okay.
Right? When it comes to, the blood patterns and the defects and the injuries, so they may draw certain conclusions that are just not factually accurate with, having an expert taking a look at this crime scene.
For some reason, Reverend Lynn seems to be credible to investigators because he comes back 2 weeks later and he goes to the Villisca house with a group of investigators. So I don't know if he says, I have experience looking into things like this, but they let him walk around the house. And he says he found a glass vial in a closet in the room where Lena and Ina slept. And he doesn't say what they think the vial was for. But he's saying, I'm investigating too. So he starts introducing himself as a minister and a Scotland Yard trained detective because he's got that English accent. He thinks the killer was a relative, like the estranged brother-in-laws that were cleared by police that were kind of sketchy, but they provided alibis. So, he says, well, I think that, that these guys had a grudge for some reason against their family and did that. So he's throwing this kind of stuff out there.
Yeah, well, a relative kind of adds up with, my initial thought with the Moore's heads all being covered. But this is a very odd scenario that Reverend Lynn sounds like a narcissist. He's in some ways because of his status as a reverend, he's kind of hiding. If I use the term hiding behind the cloth, who's going to suspect a religious man of committing these types of crimes? And so he's potentially, if he's the offender, as a narcissist, he believes that his occupation, is sort of a shield against suspicion.
But if Reverend Lynn is the killer in this case, wouldn't the covering up of the faces and the covering up of the mirrors indicate it could have been a religious man who also did this?
Well, when you think about that covering of the mirrors, the covering of the heads, the mirrors, as I mentioned before, he doesn't want to see himself. Mm-hmm. And if he truly has any type of faith, but then is a killer of this magnitude, you could see the contradiction in the psychology where he could be struggling with compulsions, where he goes out and commits these crimes, and is not wanting to look at himself as this religious figure that is committing these types of this homicide, these sexual assaults of an underage girl. So there's an aspect to it where it adds up. That's very much, he would be diametrically opposed internally, having let's say, a strong religious faith, but then committing this type of crime. Mm-hmm. And then that could account, for this oddity of the covering up of the mirrors.
Well, he has that theory I told you, he says he witnesses this man casting a shadow from the street lamp, and, he sneaks into the house, and there was a stranger on the train. He had described a stranger on the train to the investigators, and the investigators say they checked with the folks on the train. I mean, it's 5:19 in the morning. It's not a crowded train. And they said, there's nobody who is shabbily dressed and is tall and, kind of a transient type person. Also, they said that the night of June 9th, the night that he says the man was creeping around and there was an accomplice, it was a really cloudy night. So there was not a lot of moonlight, and the power company had shut off the city's power. So there were no street lamps. So not that if we're thinking, I don't know what is happening in Reverend Lynn's head, but the theory that he's thrown out, as well as I'm sure the glass vial, is all BS. The question is he, to use the unscientific term, loony, or is he the person involved in this?
Yeah.
No.
So a lot of it has to do, could he have seen what he claims to have seen? And then, how rigorous was the interview of him, to nail down aspects of whether he was involved or not? Does he make any admissions of any specialized knowledge that only the killer would know? Mm-hmm. And so, I think right now, this is the first suspect you're presenting to me, but, off the top, I'm going, wow, he sounds kind of interesting to me. One of the things that I would be also pursuing is, can I place him in these other towns where axe murders occurred?
Yeah,
he's a traveling preacher, right?
Yep.
So,
absolutely. Okay, suspect number 2. So this is in fall of 1912. Frank Fernando Jones.
Okay,
and I told you to kind of remember that because that's where the bloodhounds stopped short, right? When they were sniffing the blood at his mansion. He's a very wealthy man. He's in Villisca. This is his hometown, or this is where he's been living. So the bloodhounds had stopped. So that was reason number 1. They didn't forget about Reverend Lynn, but they're trying to cover all their bases. They look at Frank, and I think that was one of the main reasons why, but there's another good reason. Frank is a prominent, powerful citizen. He's a merchant. He's a banker. He's part of the Methodist community, and he's also a state senator, an Iowa state senator.
Oh, wow.
So there is a lot of well-known animosity between Frank Jones and Josiah Moore. So sometime before 1907, Frank had hired Josiah to sell farming equipment at his store. And when Josiah resigned to establish his own store, which was the John Deere kind of franchise, it was in direct competition to the Jones store. And Frank, was very upset because it sounds like Josiah took the company's contract with John Deere Plow Company with him. And Frank was furious. And by 1912, the two men were no longer on speaking terms. So this was the year they were murdered. In fact, they couldn't even walk on the same street. So now we're talking about, is this revenge? There's a little something deeper I'll tell you about, but just on the surface, What do you think? A business conflict? These two guys hate each other, but there doesn't seem to be a recent inciting incident that we know of.
Well, I think, going back to the crime scene, you have, the most violence was inflicted on Josiah, so that possibly could indicate, that he was the intended target, which could be consistent with this animosity that Frank has for him. But it's also possible he's the biggest threat to the offender, and there's no additional animosity that the offender has for Josiah versus the other victims in the house. But if we take, when you start talking about prior relationships, sometimes these things fester. And even though there wasn't any type of recent issue between Frank and Josiah that anybody knew about, there could be something simmering inside of Frank to go and commit this crime. Now, it seems like it's a bit up and beyond just a vindictive style homicide over a business transaction, taking out an entire family as well as two unrelated little girls. I mean, that is that's really taking things to an extreme for this type of motive, but I wouldn't discount it. But there's some inconsistencies. Why would Frank be covering the mirrors? There's some aspects of this which you go, well, this seems not necessarily in line with this type of scenario, but I couldn't discount it entirely for sure.
There are 3 suspects, and it sounds like even today the camps are split between 2.
Okay.
One is Reverend Lynn and one is Frank. Here's one of the things about Frank. There is a rumor that has been going around that I don't believe was verified, that Josiah was having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law, who is married to Frank's son, Albert. Okay. So it becomes personal, and there's a whole, little kind of write-up about what is involved with that. So let me tell you about that. Okay, so she is 22. Her name is Donna. And this all goes, sign of the times. This all pops up because of the telephone company operators. So Mutual Telephone Company has operators who obviously connect houses to houses. So they connected Josiah to Donna at least a dozen times in the months leading up to the murder. And there doesn't seem to be a reason why, especially because he's arguing with his father-in-law. Josiah's not the only one who's been calling her of the male persuasion. I don't know if we can call it that, but she was speaking more frequently to a doctor named Dr. Lomas. This was not because they were having an affair. The speculation is that she was looking to terminate a pregnancy. No. Then the guy that was definitely having an affair with her is this guy named Albert Davey. He's a local real estate and insurance salesman, and he dialed her number a lot, according to the operators. And this is a kind of a juicy bit of gossip. If we want to, take this as for what it is, Albert Davey and Donna were caught in bed by Donna's husband, Albert, so Frank's son. There was a scuffle, and someone had called, or there was a scuffle, and they knocked the phone off from the receiver, and the operators could hear what was happening. Okay, so the operators say they heard the husband, Albert, shoot the boyfriend. And he did lose part of his thumb. So this is why Frank is a really, really viable suspect, or Frank and Albert together. If Josiah is really having an affair with the son's wife, the son has already proven that he's violent. He tries to shoot the other guy. And this is what leads us to Frank Jones. What do you think?
Obviously, there's a lot of churn in terms of Frank and Josiah with the business, with the affair. Now I'd be digging into Frank in terms of, okay, I mean, we have a young girl that's sexually assaulted in this homicide. She's, she may have been killed first and sexually assaulted, or sexually assaulted and then killed. I don't have any information to be able to determine the sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be wanting to know, Frank's past. What are the rumors about Frank? Is he, molesting other kids over the course of his adult history? Is he somebody that does seem to have a preference for children as for sex? And that would further elevate Frank in my mind, potentially as a suspect. Now it does come down to, you've presented two suspects, and one is traveling around the countryside,
mm-hmm.
and the other is, stationary and has a personal beef with the adult male victim, Josiah. So is there any information that I could discern that those other cases are related? Not having the capability in 1912 to use modern technology. Now it's going to be that investigate. This is where you have to look at these cases, as we talked about in the first episode. You can't just dismiss the possibility of a series,
right.
Nor can you dismiss the possibility that the Moore homicide is a standalone.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at both. And so I've got these two suspects, and now, as I mentioned before with Reverend Lind, can I place Reverend Lind in these other locations where we have other similar homicides?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, with Frank, it's now Investigation 101 as a standalone case, and a lot of it is going to be having to do with, well, where were you that night? Right?
Yep.
What, is he just saying, well, I was asleep at home with my wife, which, okay, you don't have a strong alibi, but, you have to start building that type of database on details from Frank to see what's adding up and what's not.
Mm-hmm. I don't believe Albert has a strong alibi. Otherwise, they wouldn't focus on him this much. Why they are really looking at him, besides the whole affair rumor and all of that, and his propensity for violence, is the morning that Reverend Lynn is on a train at 5:19 in the morning. At 6:50 in the morning, just an hour or so before the Moore family is discovered, Albert had been seen leaving out of town with a guy named W.B. Burt McCall, and he is a local pool hall manager. And inexplicably later, somebody displays a piece of Josiah's skull, probably the bit that was stolen, I imagine, put on display in Burt's pool room showcase. And there is a tailor in town that says that he cleaned blood from one of Albert's suits shortly after the murder. But that is really it.
Okay, so Albert is the one that is being looked at as a suspect and not Frank.
Well, so it would be, is it Frank with Frank's help? Or, did Frank
Albert's
do
help.
it? Yeah. Or did Frank do it on behalf of Albert? So they're looking at both, but Frank is the one. So, I mean, it's kind of pick or choose. The guy who's being cheated on, or his father who has been ripped off. And so the Moores, Josiah Moore specifically, if this is true, has pissed them both off for different reasons. But there's still a sex assault or it just, to me, doesn't make any sense.
No, and wearing a suit, let's say you're going to wear a suit and you're going to be hiding behind bales of hay
right.
in the barn and sneaking into a house and, this clean, I'd want to know, okay, what kind of, blood patterns were seen on this suit, because I could venture a guess that there would be something that would indicate, okay, now you've got a bludgeoning, or you have, the use of an axe or some cast off on the back of the suit, cast off droplets, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
There'd be aspects that I'd want to know. Does what was he? You said he was a tailor or
it was a tailor who said he cleaned this suit after the murders, but and we don't know how much blood. It doesn't sound like it was covered with blood. So
okay,
I'm not sure I'm buying any of that.
Yeah, that's kind of tough. I don't know. I think that the kind of the unusual aspects within this crime scene, the sexual assault, it doesn't add up as well with this financial motive, this beef over the affair, versus you have somebody that potentially is a sexually motivated predator.
And then you've got Reverend Lynn, who is inserting himself in the case all over the place and acting like he's Scotland Yard and trying to control things.
Yeah. It's bizarre.
Yeah, it is bizarre. So there's a third suspect who we'll touch on briefly, but he is ruled out basically because there's a fingerprint expert who, the FBI one, with all the contaminated fingerprints, who say that he says that there is a guy named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Moore family, but spelled the same way. This fingerprint agent with the FBI says, I think it's this guy. And this is the last primary suspect. So on March 17th, 1913, this guy, Lee Moore, had been convicted and sentenced to life in the Missouri State Penitentiary for the double murder of his mother and his grandmother in Columbia, Missouri. So both of these women had been bludgeoned with an axe in their bedrooms, and the axe was discarded in a ravine behind the house. And in Lee's hotel room, there had been bloody clothes, and that sealed the deal. But, Lee is ruled out because it sounds like they can confirm that he was in Columbia, Missouri during the time period when the axe murders are happening. So that was the only thing. And the FBI agent, I'm not quite sure why he thought that this guy was the guy, the fingerprint expert, but they throw him out there as like a Hail Mary, I guess. But he's in Columbia. Now, I don't know how you can account for somebody. He's not in prison in Columbia, but I don't know how you can account for somebody, in another state the whole time. But they say no.
Yeah, I suspect that fingerprint examiner probably did work on that case and was told some of the details and said, hey, that sounds like the one that's up there in Iowa, right? Because axes were used in both cases. If that's the only reason why this Henry Moore is even associated with it, and they're saying, well, we can place him down there in Missouri, I don't think it's necessarily an elimination, but he becomes, a far less likely suspect than the other two.
Yeah.
I think, Reverend Lynn and Frank right now are probably 1A and 1B.
Mm-hmm. The Moores are so upset about all of this because they feel like this is being botched. Like they don't have a good suspect. I mean, they're looking at suspects, but it's not moving quickly enough for them. So the Moores and the Montgomerys, who is Sarah Moore's family, and the Stillingers, who are Ina and Lena's parents, they hire a private investigator from the Burns Detective Agency. This was not a good thing. The guy did nothing but take their money, essentially, and didn't get anywhere, which is so sad to me. I mean, I've written about that for a long time. Of course, there are families that try to hire the clairvoyants or the mediums or, for any kind of help, or people who turn to cyber sleuths who might not be able to be helpful at all. But, you also have the private investigators who can do a world of good, but you also might get somebody who just mucks up the case. And this guy did nothing for them.
Yeah. Well, to be frank, this case was messed up from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah.
You just, have an inexperienced investigator, contaminated crime scene. Now let's say, sounds like Reverend Lynn was discovered fairly early, and now the way they're interacting with him does not sound appropriate in terms of, well, he's a suspect. Let's, dial this in and get him locked into some statements and investigate him.
Mm-hmm. Well, get ready. So now we're going back to Reverend Lynn. So in December of 1913, so this is, about a year and a half after the murders, Lynn went from Villisca to Winner, South Dakota. And he has become known as just like a crank and a loudmouth. He frequently rants about the Villisca murders. This is what he says. He says he's ranting about how Sarah Moore had woken amid the chaos and how the killer, of course, used an axe on everybody, but had taken his bloody shirt to a Council Bluff laundry to be cleaned. How this murderer was, unable to control his fiendish mania. And on multiple occasions, he confessed to having committed the crime himself. And then I have his background.
Okay. Well, Reverend Lynn is a nut job. I mean,
but is he a murderous nut job is the question.
Well, there's some red flags coming up here, right? He's, making some statements, such as Sarah waking up. Only the killer would know that. Mm-hmm. Now, why is Reverend Lynn throwing that out there like he has some sort of clairvoyant insight as to what happened? Or like what I talked about before when he's, kind of inserting himself into the investigation and saying, I saw this, guy sneaking into the house and I heard thuds. There's leakage about what he really does know about the case. Mm-hmm. And he's expressing that. And if he's, as a reverend, confessing, I'm assuming, to, private parties about, having committed these crimes. Well, why is he making those statements? Is he just trying to impress whoever he's talking to? Or, are these moments of truth, where he's talking? Is he under the influence and is going, hey, the tongue is a little free at this point?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you more about him. He had been posting advertisements for a female stenographer who was also willing to pose nude. Okay.
So he's trying to hire somebody like that.
Yep. And he is arrested for sending multiple obscene letters to one of the ad's respondents. Okay. Then the investigators are trying to figure out his mental health status, which is not good. He explodes into profanities when he is brought in by the Sioux Falls jail. He is crying and he offers to perform sexual acts on his cellmates. He sexually harasses another prisoner. He tries to hang himself. He admits to murdering the Moore family and the girls in Villisca. And then they hold a sanity hearing for him because now he's confessed to all this stuff. So they say, okay, well, we're going to charge you. There's a sanity hearing that is about 2 years after the murders. He can't remember his name, he says. He seemed delusional, paranoid, psychotic, and he's transferred to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in D.C. And after undergoing psychotherapy, with God knows what techniques. I don't know what that means, but in 1914, it would be questionable maybe. He is deemed sane and he's released in January of 1915. Over the next year and a half, this happens 2 more times. And when he's released for a 3rd time, he vanishes, essentially.
So the kind of this, if you want to call them psychotic breaks that he's demonstrating, there is some churn in terms of his psychology, his personality with the type of offender that I would imagine would be committing the Villisca axe homicides. But you still have to, show his involvement in the case, which these things that are happening afterwards, it's like, has nothing to do with the homicide. It's just, okay, this guy's, he's a little bit on the strange side, but we can place him in Villisca at the time of the homicides. We can place him at the church where the victims spent the entire day. So there is proximity, but you still now have to put him inside the house. He's made confessions, okay, but what are the details of those confessions? And can we use those details of those confessions and correlate those with details that only the killer would know? And I haven't heard anything yet along those lines. But if it is Reverend Lynn, if he's the Valeska killer, then there's a strong chance that he is the responsible for the prior homicides in the other states.
Yeah.
And how much investigation went into those?
Well, and they're independent because they decided not to investigate them as a series. So let me tell you about this. So I would say at this point, Reverend Lynn is in the wind. It's been now 3 years. But just about 100 miles from where he was last, we're in Omaha, Nebraska. And there is a woman named Ada Swanson. She's a Swedish domestic servant. She's found bludgeoned to death with a hatchet in her employer's basement. The entire back portion of her skull is crushed. Traces of blood on her lower legs indicate that her murderer moved her body after she died. And the coroner describes the killer as a moral pervert. I don't see face covered or some of that other stuff. But the reason they're interested is because Reverend Lynn's mentor is part of a seminary that is right across the street from where this woman lived.
Can we put Reverend Lynn at that seminary around the time frame of the homicide?
He's in the wind. He's gone. Nobody knows where he is right now.
I mean, it is interesting for sure. It's... I think, the way that when I've worked cases, where multiple suspects are involved, eventually somebody rises to the level of a prime suspect. And the media often misuses how law enforcement uses the term suspect. Mm-hmm. The media, says, well, if somebody's named a suspect, then we're going to, run with that name and put it out into the public. And it's like, no. We're just classifying this person as a suspect because there's something suspicious about them that we have to kind of resolve. And most of the time, we're able to eliminate these people that we, designate as suspects. But every now and then somebody rises to a level where you go, okay, there is enough going on where I cannot ignore this person. It's not just suspicious. There is now getting to a point to where, in a law enforcement kind of parlance, this person is now, approaching reasonable suspicion, and I may be developing probable cause, right? And so it's now getting this person that is suspicious and going, oh, no, now I have a tie to the nexus, of the crime. There is now a connection, and is this person responsible or not? And that's when you take that next step. Yeah, and so with Reverend Lynn, I'm going, he's a prime suspect right now. Is he, has he risen above that? But he's got my devoted attention if I'm working this case.
Okay, well, let's get into this because they are able at some point to track him down. There is a grand jury because now everybody's convinced. And this happens in April of 1917, 5 years almost later. There's testimony about how wacky he sounds in jail, his erratic behavior, history of sexual harassment and assault, which I have more information about. He had those confessions. The attorney general really talks about Lena and the way that she appeared, and that this is the key to what he called a pedophilic peeping Tom, and that he thinks, that fits Reverend Lynn. And the fact that he covered the windows. There is a lot of what I call sex pest testimony. Sex pest is a very old term for, a pervert, essentially. So there's a lot of voyeurism in his background. And there are several families and women who describe encounters that were really uncomfortable for them. A pharmacist said that he caught Reverend Lynn peeping into his living room before the murders. And the jury also hears reports of Lynn luring young girls to his home under false pretenses and asking them to pose naked. And there's a girl from South Dakota who testifies that she had been lured to his house when she was 13. He begged her to pose naked, arguing that there were many instances in the Bible wherein characters are nude. He then showed her his collection of pornography. And the girl says, I have a friend, and the same thing happened with this friend. So it's not just, I mean, when you're talking about churn, that's more churn, I have to assume, right?
Well, no, it's showing that he's a child molester. I mean, he is actually purposefully engaging with underage girls for sexual purposes. Whether it be to pose nude. This is all part of this, what we call grooming, in terms of, hey, come take some photographs. Oh, the Bible says it's okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, now, hey, let's engage in some sexual activities. He's conditioning these girls. And this is now direct overlap with the offender who is now sexually assaulting an underage girl. So Reverend Lynn is demonstrating this sexual preference that I'm now going, okay, he's checking a massive box. And so, this idea of voyeurism, mm-hmm. or the peeping, on these young girls that they're at least suspecting that Reverend Lynn was involved with, I have a feeling that, let's say Reverend Lynn is our killer in this case. Mm-hmm. He's at the church. His target is Lena. Mm-hmm. The Moors just happened to be where Lena ended up for the night, and that's why they were killed. Yeah. It's sad.
That makes sense to me. Let me give you a couple of more details. He ends up being indicted. I don't think there's any, mystery about that. One thing that's interesting, there are witnesses that describe material evidence that connects Lynn to the murders. So remember, he went ranting about the Council Bluffs laundry where the killer had his shirt washed. A clerk says she received an unlabeled package of laundry containing a bloody shirt after the murders. She says it had the appearance of having a lot of blood, quite a lot of blood, and the shirt had the appearance of having been soaked in water and attempted to be washed out. Reverend Lynn picked it up. It was his shirt. And that's what he had said before. Now, let me shorthand something, like really shorthand something, because anybody who knows this case is going to say, Kate, how come you didn't cover this? I'm not covering this because I think it's quite frankly stupid. So this PI who had inserted himself, on the behest of the Moors, he is hell-bent on getting Frank Jones. He ends up being the one who tracks down Reverend Lynn because he wants to use Reverend Lynn to trap Frank Jones because he's convinced Frank Jones is the one who did this, either on behalf of his son or because of the grievance or whatever it was. So this PI is really mucking stuff up. Reverend Lynn had been in Nebraska. He reconnected with his wife. I don't know who's married to this guy, but Laura Kelly is. And they went to Illinois. And that's where the PI ended up tracking him down. And there's just a series of just stupidity things where, the PI is trying to get Lynn to, somehow like set a trap to claim that Frank Jones was behind all of this. They then the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office then tries to entrap Reverend Lynn because the FBI agent had believed, I think, that the person holding the axe was left-handed based on the marks on the ceiling. So they asked Lynn, do you want to go out and chop wood while you're being held in jail? And he said, sure. And he's left-handed. So, there's that.
I wouldn't put any weight on that.
I know. So I'll tell you about the shirt. I know you want to talk about the shirt, but let me get to the trial also. There's a big series of interrogations. Once they finally get Lynn, he has been indicted. He says on August 31st, very early in the morning, I felt God wanted me to slay utterly. Then, driven by the Bible verse, suffer little children to come unto me. He says he took the axe and sent those children somewhere. 3 hours later, he makes another confession. This one differs in the order that he killed the victims. But, this is where they stand, and then they're going to put him on trial. So what do you think? The shirt is the most interesting thing to me out of all of that, even more than confessions.
Well, we know, at the crime scene, you have a bowl that appears to have been used by the offender to clean up? You know, and is that just him washing his hands, or is he recognizing that, you know, his clothing is soiled with blood? You also have outdoors on the back porch, another bowl with dirty water in it. So, you know, the shirt coming in per the cleaners saying, you know, it looked like there had been previous attempts to wash it. Well, that could have occurred. You know, if he's recognizing I've got blood all over me, I need, before I start walking out of this house, I need to kind of clean up and try to get rid of this blood on my clothing. That could be consistent. You know, it's a circumstantial piece of evidence back in 1912, 1915, whenever this actually is being stated. You know, today, if we could find that shirt, we could actually turn it into physical evidence, you know, to say, yes, this has victims, you know, dilute victims' blood on it. So the timing of this bloody shirt coming into the cleaner, the condition of that shirt, it does seem to be consistent with the circumstances within the crime scene. So I think that is, you know, it's significant circumstantial evidence, but they probably never recovered that shirt. Am I correct about that?
You're correct.
Yeah. So now, you know, you would think that the cleaner wouldn't have any type of motive to lie, but that is a massive, well, where's the shirt? You know, we never recovered it. And we go to Reverend Lynn. Where's the shirt? So it's something that, you know, it's finger pointing at best, saying, well, at least, you know, you have somebody who really has no motive to make something up, to say, hey, this is what we experienced. And then, was there a receipt? Is there any way to recover that through business records that it was actually Reverend Lynn that picked up the shirt? So, but it is interesting for sure, you know, and things, you know, Reverend Lynn, you know, I've already said, yeah, he's a prime suspect, and there's churn. You know, there's no question there's churn. It's now, can you prove that he is the actual killer?
Yeah.
And this is where, you know, I don't know how this case ended, you know, but right now I'm going, God, it seems like they got the right guy.
All right. Well, let me tell you about something that's really disturbing, and then we'll get to what happens, because you've already heard all the evidence. You know, there's nothing new. There's a theory about the bacon, and I really, Paul, don't want to talk about this very much. Okay. So the DA thinks that Reverend Lynn was impotent and he used the bacon to masturbate.
Okay.
I don't even know what to say about that.
I wouldn't dismiss that.
Yeah.
You know, so with these sexually motivated offenders, it's not uncommon for them to be able to become erect.
Right.
Or, you know, so they can't penetrate. But sometimes what they will do is they will masturbate over the victim or while looking at the victim. And this is something where, when I'm talking to law enforcement, you know, whether you're as an investigator or you're a CSI, don't just think that the evidence is in or on the body. It is potentially in the area around the body. You have to be taking a look for that ejaculate. And it is a known phenomenon with these types of offenders. So I would not dismiss the idea that, you know, and this was a fairly sizable piece of bacon, that somehow, you know, it was used. But I would say that that's probably as good of an explanation for that bacon being in that room next to the murder weapon as any.
You've heard everything. Essentially, the defense is he's crazy, but he's not a killer. So he should be in an insane asylum. He should not be in prison. Okay. Yeah. And they say, of course, he's not the killer of these people. What do you think is the verdict?
He probably was, you know, ruled not guilty by reason of insanity is what I'm guessing.
Hung jury for the first one.
Okay.
Then they retry him. And the judge in the second one omitted his confession from evidence because of the coercion accusations. 5:30 in the morning, he says this was, horrible. And so the focus for the state becomes his proximity to the crimes, his history of mental illness, the lewd conduct, all of that stuff. And ultimately, it is a 4.5-hour deliberation, not guilty. So he walks.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Most certainly in today's day and age, I don't think they've got a case that should have been taken to trial.
Yeah.
Or even necessarily charged. I think they're on the right track. Back in 1912 with the limitations that they had, now they're relying on some circumstantial evidence. I guess I'm not surprised that you now have an acquittal, just because it's not, they can't prove, he has confessions being thrown out, I don't know what kind of details these confessions had, but you have, you have an agency, you have probably a prosecutor. They don't know what they're looking at this crime scene. They don't know how to interpret this crime scene, so can they truly correlate details in his confession to facts at the crime scene, that only the killer would know and be able to articulate that? They probably can't. So in some ways, with the information that you've presented, I think Reverend Lynn appears to be a very, very solid suspect that I would even say is likely responsible for the Valeska homicides. However, I can't quibble with the acquittal just based off of the types of evidence being presented to the jury.
Yeah.
I think they moved before they should have. They needed to build a stronger case.
Yeah. So, okay, after he is acquitted, he and his wife go to Chicago and they go to New York. But there's, other stuff that follows them around. He's a patient from 1930 until 1942 at a mental state hospital for the chronically insane is what they called it. Then his wife dies. And in 1957, he goes to another hospital in Long Island, the Central Islip State Mental Hospital. And then a couple of years later, he dies at age 80. So I don't know if he talked about these murders or what happens after that, but officially that case is still unsolved in Iowa.
No, that's crazy. And was he ever investigated for the other cases?
Nope. Not that I know of, because they split him apart thanks to that Illinois guy.
I'd wonder if there's any public records that would be in existence today that could place him in one of those jurisdictions. I just need one. Right?
Okay. Maybe. We can look. I mean, he's dumb enough probably to use his own name. I can poke around and see.
Well, you think about some of these churches, they'll have, what do you want to call them, guest logs?
Yeah.
And they archive those.
Yeah.
Does he show up at a church in Colorado Springs and sign a guest log? And it's contemporaneous with that X murder that happened, where I live. Maybe I need to figure out what church he would have been at.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can definitely dig around and look, and I think that would be really interesting. I don't know what DNA would be like from back then, what they collected, what's still there, if there's something on display. But anyway, this is a great case. I think it's really upsetting and sad, but also I think you learn a lot from a case like this, especially with the profiling part, which I know you enjoy too. But I think we got a little smattering of everything in this case. A lot of discussion about the victims, a lot of, talk about blood this and, what this means and what slab of bacon, which I really didn't want to know about, but a well-rounded case, I would say, Paul Holes.
Nope, for sure. And it just reminds me, the one Iowa case that I actually did get involved with was basically an axe murder. hatcheted to death, probably not an axe, but a hatchet in their hotel room in Iowa. And the likely suspect was a transient guy that I think was involved in other hatchet murders of men, in other states. So it's very similar. But this case happened in 1980, and so obviously no overlap with the 1912 case.
Probably not.
But something's going on in Iowa. What's up with Iowa and axes?
What's up with California, Paul? I mean, don't you have a lot of murderers there too, in Texas too?
Yeah, California is a busy area.
Okay, next week we will probably not have a California story, although I would welcome a good California story. I don't know if we've had one for a while. So
it has been a while.
We'll see, and I will see you next week.
All right. Looking forward to it as always.
Me too.